Hello, good afternoon to you all. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you, and I want to thank Nicola for inviting me. This is a great honor for me. So I'm going to be speaking with you on species and matter in Roger Bacon's De multiplicatione specierum, and I'm going to focus my talk on his concept of species. I will first say a few general words about the way he does physics, because I'm going to be speaking about natural philosophy today. So he has a very unique account of the species in medio, it is very important to say from the outset that what he's doing is physics. He's not very much interested in metaphysics and not at all in theology. His framework is the frame laid down by Averroes for physical science, and that means that no superreal causes are allowed into physics, and the mechanisms of nature, of physics, are should be immanent, and nature is considered as autonomous, and the causes we're looking for are always immanent to nature. No God, no dator formarum, no seminal reasons. So that's the overall scheme which we are dealing with. So what I will do today, I will try to address and clarify some of the main features of Bacon's account of species, which are meant to, species stand at the heart of every physical action and every physical process in Bacon's physics. It is the most basic and most important concept in his physics. And I'm going to leave aside, species have for sure also a very important function in cognitive processes and in epistemology, but I'm not going to deal with that in this talk today. I will say something about the place of species in Bacon's natural philosophy first, and then I will try to suggest why he needs this concept in the first place. I will describe some of its basic features, not all, because there's not enough time, and I will concentrate on the question of how species are produced, how they are multiplied, first in the medium, and then within the matter of the recipient. I will say a few words about time and species, time and physical action in Bacon, and then just something small about theology. So let's start. So Bacon begins, and Nicola tells me that you've read this part already. He begins his treatise on species with a terminological statement. So he says there's lots of concepts that are used in this context: idol, image, similitude, form, intentio, the shadow of the philosophers, passion, impression. All these terms are in fact one and the same thing, namely species. And I hear that you were discussing why the question, why is Bacon doing this? Why does he say that all those different terms are in fact one and the same thing? He thinks there's a mess. He thinks that there's the scholars are using lots of different concepts, but their meaning somehow overlaps, and their meaning is not clear enough. And what he's trying to do, at least this is how I suggest to understand his effort, is he's trying to establish a new and unified philosophical vocabulary. He wants to create a clear conceptual frame for his physical science. He's actually looking for a universal science, much like scientists today are looking for the grand theory that will combine together biology, chemistry, and physics, and this is what actually Bacon is trying to do. He's looking for universal science, and species is the concept at the heart of this new universal science he's trying to establish. And he's in fact aiming at reduction, and what he's doing is a sort of an application of Occam's razor, long before Occam himself thought about it, actually before Occam himself was born. he's trying to reduce this plethora of concepts and place only one very well elaborated concept, and by this concept he's trying to explain everything. And by everything, I mean natural phenomena, all natural phenomena, and also cognitive processes and intellectual processes. So I'm not going to speak about that today, but species have a very important function in cognitive and intellectual processes as well. So what seems to be only a terminological standardization is in fact a conceptual one as well. And the whole book of the multiplicatione specierum is devoted to the definition and the description of this concept of species. So one of the most important and salient features of or characteristics of this concept of species is its universality. Bacon proclaimed his search for universal science, and at the core of this science he placed species. So this universality has a few aspects. First, it is not only a concept used to explain vision or to explain light. It is used to explain all five senses. Well, maybe with the exception of hearing. You will read it as you proceed with the multiplicatione, but basically he says that all species, all senses, all five senses work on the basis of species, and species are also universal because almost every being issues them. The only exceptions are the unspecified prime matter and features related to matter, such as quantity and motion, surface, relation, position, time, shape, size. All these, Bacon says, are qualities of matter, and only active agents produce species, and matter in itself is not active. So other than these qualities, all other things produce species. The nature, the world, the natural world in Bacon's eyes is very, very active. Species are posited as efficient in both sensory level and natural processes. And every natural transmutation, Bacon says, is made through species. So you cannot explain anything that happens in nature, and you don't have causality in nature without species. So why does he need this concept in the first place? Well, actually, there is a problem with Aristotle. Aristotle left a lacuna. In his account of generation, and when I speak about generation, I speak both of substantial generation, that is the change from non-substance to substance, such as, for example, when water are turned into earth. That's a substantial generation or substantial change. And accidental generation, such as when cold water turns hot. Okay, that's a change in equality, an accidental change or accidental generation. So all these, both these kinds of generation follow three basic principles according to Aristotle. One, there is a matter to be transformed. Two, there is a singular agent, which is the efficient cause, and there is the causational synonymy principle. Everything is generated from its synonym. It is sometimes called also the such-like principle. And it means that a thing can generate its like. A thing can only generate something the same as itself. And in Aristotelian terms, it means that the actuality of the agent and the potentiality of the patient has to match somehow. Meaning the patient has to have a potential for this specific form. Okay, it has to be able to receive this specific form. Not every matter can receive every form. For example, soft matter cannot receive a form of an axe, for example. Okay, so that's the principle of causational synonym. a man begets a man, an oak begets an oak, fire begets fire. Okay, that's the three principles of generation in Aristotle. So we always have an agent. You know, this is the active party in the process, and the agent has to insert a form into the patient, and the patient is the passive party in the process of generation. And as we all know, Aristotle identified activity or actuality with form and passivity or potentiality with matter. So the agent will always have a form which it could transmit to that which lacks it, and that's generation. Okay. Now, what's the problem with this? So the problem is that the details of this transmission are not very clear. Aristotle did not elaborate on this point. He does not say much about it. So the right model of physical action is to say, according at least to Aristotle and Averroes, is to say that nothing is previously given as an actual being in the matter to be acted. Nothing is present as an actual form or an already existing being of any kind in the patient before he receives the form from the agent. He has a potency for receiving the form, but this potency means that he is passive in the process of generation. But now we have a few questions about that, or Bacon have, and his contemporaries too. There's no concrete model of the physical adduction of this form, and it is not clear how this form is transmitted from the agent to the patient. What is the mechanism? Is the agent introducing something from its own substance or power, or is it creating something completely new? Is matter in some way active in this process, or is it completely passive? How can the form be activated in the interior of the object, not only on its surface? How can it enter to its core? And how can a form traverse the distance between the agent and patient in case of action at a distance, for example, magnetic attraction or celestial influences? So these were the problems that the physical concept of species was meant to resolve. And we'll see soon how it resolves it, according to Bacon. So first, let's see what is a species. Bacon ties species right from the outset with efficient causality. His strict definition of species is that it is, and I quote, the first effect of any natural agent. And that's in De Multiplicatione, first part of the first chapter. As its first effect, a species resembles its agent, and again, I quote, in nature, specific essence, and operation. A species, according to Bacon, must be of the same category, namely the same genus, as its agent. Thus, the species of substance is substance, the species of accident is an accident, the species of a composite is a composite, the species of a form is form, and so on. And in fact, this is an explication of the principle of causational synonymy, which is an Aristotelian principle, but Bacon moves this to the relation not between agent and patient, but between agent and its species. So from this very strict notion of similarity or resemblance between the agent and its species, the outcome is that a species of something material must be material in itself, and this is not straightforward, because many of Bacon's contemporaries didn't think that species were material. Bacon was quite unique in this respect. So he thinks that the species does not only resemble the agent's form, it resembles its matter as well. In other words, a species is not a form, but a composite. So Bacon writes, for example, in the second part of the first chapter of De Multiplicatione, in pages 21 to 31, he writes, the species of a substance is not only the species of its form, but also of its matter and of the entire composite. Therefore, the composite produces a species, and the species is a similitude of the entire composite. It is necessary that where form or the species of form is generated, their matter or the species of matter is also generated, and therefore a composite species is generated. So this is the point in Bacon's account of species, which was most, as I said before, was most objected by his contemporaries. They considered species as a similitude of the form of the agent alone, at least most of them, not all of them. And Bacon provides some rationale for this unique position. First, a species is similar to the agent in name, essence, and definition. Therefore, it is of the same category as its agent. And if the agent is material, then the species has to be material as well. Second, Aristotle says in the Anima 1 that all operations are of composite things. So species are operative, so they have to be composites. Third, there can be no proper form except in proper matter. Forms cannot just travel around without matter. So it is necessary that where the species of form is generated, the species of matter will also be generated, and therefore a composite species is generated, Bacon writes. And says, since each agent issues only one univocal first effect, and since matter alone cannot issue species, it must be a composite, the species. By one and the same, and this is a quote, by one and the same action of the composite, through its form, the species of the entire composite is generated in the recipient. In the same way as a composite is generated in complete natural generation, so it is in the incomplete generation of species. And this is another feature of species. They are incomplete. Bacon understands intentional being, the intentional being of species in the medium, as equivalent to their incompleteness. And he writes, where incomplete matter and incomplete form and an incomplete composite come into being, as the being of the species requires. So species are an incomplete composite. Incomplete meaning that it is not really it's not really a thing in the world. It has Bacon somewhere says that species has a deficient being. Their being is not full, it's partial. So now let's get to the main question I deal with here and this is how species are produced. How do they multiply? So Bacon discussed this question in the first part of the De Multiplicatione, the third part of the first chapter, in pages 44 to 47, and he draws the following conclusions. First, a species cannot exit from or be emitted by the agent itself. Okay, the reason is that emitting something from itself would amount to the agent's corruption. If the species are emitted from the matter and from the form of the agent, then eventually he will emit everything he has, the agent. And so, and the activity of the agent is supposed to perfect it, not corrupt the agent, says Bacon. So a species is not emitted. The metaphor of emanation is not correct for how species are produced. Second point, the agent does not create a species ex nihilo, since it is not the creator. This is, I think, pretty clear. Species are not just made out of nothing. They have to be made out of something. The third point, the agent does not receive a species from outside itself and from outside the recipient and then deposit it in the recipient. Okay, Bacon says that this is absurd. The agent does not find somewhere there in the air and just puts it in the recipient. There has to be another mechanism. Another option rejected by Bacon is that a species does not come out into existence through an impression, in the narrow sense of an action of surface. Because natural action, Bacon stresses, occurs in the interior of the recipient and impression remains on the surface. So also the metaphor of impression is not the right one for explaining how species are produced. So how are they produced? The way the species come into existence is, and I quote, by bringing forth out of the potentiality of the recipient matter, as Aristotle has demonstrated, Bacon claims. Now, if we understand that species come into existence by the passive potentiality of matter, says Bacon, this leads to the wrong theory of the dator formarum, which is contrary to the teaching of... therefore, that's his conclusion. The species is brought forth out of the active potentiality of the matter of the recipient. Note, not the passive potentiality of the matter of the recipient, as Aristotle said, but the active potentiality of the matter of the recipient. In other words, the agent steers the patient into generating this virtue from itself. The agent somehow encourages the patient to produce the species in itself. Okay, so now let's try to see what is this active potentiality of matter. What does Bacon mean by that? And the full, the full explanation is not given in the De Multiplicatione, but in the Communia Naturalium. And there, Bacon says that the vulgar assign three principles to Aristotle. To Aristotle's explanation of generation. You have the matter, you have the potency of that matter, and this potency is an appetite to a form, or it is sometimes called privation. And you need the form. Okay, so you need three things: matter, form, and the potency of the matter to receive the form. These three are supposed as the principles of every natural action, says Bacon. So privation is that by which matter desires completion. It is a natural potency which can readily strive and receive its completion, namely the form. Okay? And this, Bacon says, this is the active potency. This privation, this potency of matter to receive a certain form is active. Okay? It is not passivity on the side of the recipient, because the recipient matter expediates its completion, its perfection. It strives to receive that form, and this is not being passive. This is active, says Bacon. A passive potency, on Bacon's understanding, is the principle of corruption, which is a potency found everywhere in corruptible things. But this is not this privation, this potency or even desire. And Bacon uses even the word conatus, which we know later from Spinoza, for example, which is it's a sort of desire. It's something very active. So the privation is an active potency by which matter desires its perfection. So the matter of the recipient has an active role in taking the form in. Bacon defines the active potency as the essence of the material principle, and its potency as well. It is the essence as considered in itself, and it is potency considered as the appetite promoting and perfecting the substance. The substance wants to perfect itself. It has an inner desire to do that. This placing of the active potency within the recipient matter does not conform with Aristotle, who placed the active potency in the agent and the passive potency in the patient. Okay, so that's a change from what we have in Aristotle, but in fact, Bacon is not the first to do that. Sharp, in a book on Franciscan philosophy, very old book on Franciscan philosophy, says that we find this understanding of the active potentiality of matter already in Grosseteste. Grosseteste maintained that potency is passive in the sense of being the subject of action, but active in reference to that which is to become, namely, because it has some inner adaptation to the form that it is capable of receiving. In this way, this is what Sharp argues, the impossibility of a transition from a pure potency to actuality is avoided. Grosseteste asserted that potency is not that there is nothing actual, but that not everything is actual. So there are grades of potency. Bacon had used the distinction between active and passive potencies in the same way as Grosseteste, says Sharp. He thought that matter's privation, namely its desire for perfection, is active inasmuch as it desires a particular new form, and it is passive inasmuch as it is able to receive an indeterminate form. Okay, so you have in the recipient both active potentiality, which is directed to receiving a certain specific form, and you have passive potentiality, which is not directed to any specific form. Bacon used the notion of active potency in order to preserve generation from being a violent or a non-natural process, says Sharp. And then Rudolphi, in her paper on matter in Bacon, considers that the notion of the active potentiality of matter enabled Bacon to read a form as a unique vehicle of being and reject the idea of perfect identity between form and actuality. And this is very, very clear. The more Bacon you read, the more you see that matter is very important to Bacon. And he says in another text that matter is not nothing but true nature and essence. And he has this argument, he argues against Averroes in his semiotics. Averroes says that a word signifies only the form of the thing that is called by this word. And Bacon says no, it is actually what a word signifies, or let's say a name signifies, the whole composite of matter and form. And Averroes says, but it signifies only the form because the form is more worthy than matter. And then Bacon answers, but if you signify the composite, you have the worthiness of the form plus the worthiness of matter. So matter is worthy in Bacon's eyes, and he refuses to see it as just mere potency. There is something more there. So Bacon seems to believe. Rodolphi argues that the theory of active potentiality is very unique and unique to Bacon, and no one else holds this position. But as Sharp thinks, I haven't checked that yet with Grosseteste. Sharp says Grosseteste is holding the same position, and what it does, it grants matter a sort of autonomy. And Bacon, when he discussed matter, he says that matter is never a pure potency. I mean, of course, there's prime matter, but in Bacon, it is only a metaphysical concept, and Bacon is not really interested in metaphysics. Physical matter is never pure potency because it is never completely without form. So matter always is inclined to something, to receive a certain form. So this is a very interesting position of Bacon regarding matter. So now I'm going to say a few words about the multiplication and the mode of existence of species in the medium. And then I will speak about the multiplication in the recipient. So for Bacon, a species once issued is independent of its agent and can continue to exist after its agent had perished. On Bacon's account, the first effect of the agent gives rise to a further effect similar to the agent and uniform with it. Once the first effect is produced, further effects similar to the first one are on the way. And I quote, "A species, once it has been multiplied in the medium, requires only the medium, and by itself, from its active power, it can produce its like." So the species is active. It is not only dependent on its agent. It has a sort of power of its own. Once issued, a species becomes not only independent of its source, but also it becomes a secondary cause, producing other species. Bacon thinks of these species as identical in essence and operation, yet they are numerically and locally different. Because of their identity of essence and uniformity, on his view, they are all, in fact, one and the same effect. So they are sort of, once issued, they are independent of their source, and even if the source perishes at some point, they can continue to exert its influence. So how do the species exist in the medium? They are incorporated in it, and this is a principle of incorporation. The passage of species in the medium is not a movement. It is multiplication. What is a multiplication? It is a successive generation in the consecutive parts of the medium. So the multiplication is actually regeneration, generation and again generation and generation of each species from its previous species, and they this way they form lines. So, and this is a process of true physical transmutation. No, this is not a mutation. There's no mutation in Bacon's physics. Mutation is not in time. Mutation is made in an instant. But this is physical transmutation in matter, which means it takes time. The multiplication of species takes time. The species take on the matter of the medium. So they are always in matter. They multiply itself in the matter of the medium. This is the principle of incorporation. According to this principle, all objects express their nature through their species. But when those species exist outside their generating object, they must be incorporated in some manner. What a species actually expresses depends upon what it is incorporated with. So within the transparent medium, for example, a species expresses only the colored luminosity of the object's surface, but then when it is incorporated in the crystalline lens of the eye, it expresses the visibility of that surface. So the species can be incorporated in all sorts of matter, but in each kind of matter it will express different things, and in some types of matter it cannot express itself at all. So the power of species can only be realized when it is incorporated within something that can actually bring it out. And each sort of matter is capable of bringing out only a few of its potential expressions. This is why a magnet, for example, attracts iron, but not the intervening air. The matter of the iron enables it to express a feature which the air does not. So here we have the explanation for, or at least part of the explanation for magnetic attraction. This is very different from other thinkers in Bacon's time, because most of them thought that the being of species in the medium is not real being, it's intentional being, it is not, they didn't see it as true physical transmutation. But for Bacon it is, the being of species in the medium is a true physical process. So the species multiply in the medium, and eventually they reach a certain recipient. And there the process of multiplication continues in the same way. Only here the species take on the species of the patient, of the recipient, and transforms it to produce the final effect, which is to render the patient similar to the agent. So rendering the patient similar to the agent, this can be done only in a certain kind of matter. And this is the final recipient of the species. Bacon is arguing with a position held by other philosophers of his time, such as Olivi, Rufus, and Scotus, who made a distinction between two possibilities of contact between agent and patient. There is a contact according to substance. It is also called tactus mathematicus. And there is contact according to virtue. Again, this is the position of Olivi, Rufus, and Scotus, not of Bacon. Bacon argues against this position. Contact according to substance is the contact between the surfaces of two substances, and virtual contact is a contact of power, the kind of contact that exists from afar. So this is how Olivi, for example, explains action at a distance. Action at a distance is virtual. The virtus is immediate, instantaneous, and injected by the agent at distance and into the core of the patient. The virtus of heat, for example, is immediately infused in the core of the stone, in case of a stone getting hot by the sun, and the sun touches the stone from distance by the contact of power. The matter of the recipient then responds to the injection of power and receives an effect in time. So according to Olivi, you have a process of two stages, two steps. The first is the injection of power, which is not in time, it is immediate. And then you have the response of the matter of the recipient, which is in time. Okay, then you have the generation. Bacon rejects this distinction. His concept of species as active and material at the same time combines the two aspects that Olivier and his friends tried to separate. No physical contact, Bacon argues, is only on the surface, for physical bodies always have depth. In natural action, the active substance of the agent touches the recipient's body by its physical surface, and physical surface always have some depth. It is not mathematical surface, okay? So it is a physical contact, not a mathematical one. Thus, the distinction between tactus mathematicus and tactus virtualis is of no use for physical action. The first part of the recipient receives the species, and then it affects the second part in the interior, says Bacon, and so on, all the way to the depth of the patient. So there is no real difference between the multiplication of species in the medium and their multiplication in the matter of the recipient. It is the same thing, just different matter. And Bacon writes, he writes in pages 52, 53, this is what he writes, I quote, "The agent need not be in the interior of the recipient according to its substance or in any other way, in order for something to be brought forth out of the potentiality of the interior, because natural action does not require this. The active substance of the agent, touching the substance of the recipient without intermediary, can alter, by its active virtue and power, the first part of the recipient that it touches. And this action flows into the interior of that part, since the part is not a surface but a body, however small it may be. For since the agent touches the recipient, and not only the bare surface, but the substance of the recipient through the mediation of the surface." So according to Bacon, the very principle of physical action by real surfaces, not by mathematical ones, renders Olivier's distinction between substantial and virtual action redundant. You don't need this. You can have one concept of physical action at the heart of generation, rather than two, virtual and contact and substantial contact. You could just use the species. That's enough. So I already said something about time. I will now say a bit more. Time and physical action, time and species. Most medieval thinkers did not consider generation and corruption as type of motion, but rather as mutation or instantaneous change, while the other types of change were viewed as gradual and successive processes. The spread of light, for example, was one instance of mutation. According to Aristotle, the medium is enlightened at once. It is not, light does not have speed. And also, that's true also for many of Aristotle's interpreters. Light is a quality which the medium acquires all at once, and therefore there's no speed to light. One exception was Alhazen, which was Bacon's Muslim mentor, at least in optics, who held that light travels at a finite, although imperceptible speed, and that's also the position of Bacon. Bacon considered the multiplication of species to be generation rather than mutation. Generation, according to Bacon's account, is in time, as all other natural processes are in time. The transmission of light in the air is a real generation of species using the matter of the air, and this generation takes time. He writes, therefore, the motion of a species according to prior and posterior parts of space entails priority and posteriority in duration, and thus in time. So, and actually all physical processes in Bacon takes time. There's nothing that is non-temporal. Finally, the last thing I want to say is just a hint about why I want to go back to the terminological statement which we started from. And from all those concepts, from all those terms, Bacon chooses species. The question is why of all those terms he chose species. So I have a suggestion to make about that. In Christian theology, species, the term species was often used to denote the beauty of the highest beings, but not the beauty itself, but its earthly expressions. So the sun was considered the most sensible expression of divinity because it was incarnated in flesh and blood. So species came to be applied to the sun as a proper name. And we have one of the church fathers, Marius Victorinus, he's writing from the 4th century, he's writing about it. And so by extension, species were endowed with the functions of expressing, defining, and characterizing the general and unlimited. And they have come to be associated, or the term have come to be associated with the sensual aspects of divinity as discovered in the natural world. And so, for example, in Bonaventure, we find the observance that the process of the generation of species in the medium, if we observe that process, we are eventually led to the origin or model that this process imitates, that is, to the duality of the Father and Son. So this should be kept in mind as a background to the centrality of the concept in Bacon's philosophy of nature. And I said, when he does physics, he doesn't do theology, and he does not admit of any supernatural causes in physics. But through the study of physics and through the study of the generation of species and their activity in the natural world, we can lead our souls, or we can be reminded or have a clue as to the relation of the Trinity. So that's the theological aspect of the concept of species, and I think that Bacon made it a central concept in his philosophy of nature, among other reasons, for this reason. And this is how he at the back door inserts a little bit of theology into his physics. So now, thank you very much for being patient and listening, and I will be happy to answer your questions and discuss these things with you. Thank you.